Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Alberta's Pensions Futures webinar. My name is Lars Hallstrom. I am the director of the Prentice Institute for Global Population and Economy, and I am our host and moderator for today. I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar. It's great to see we have 68 participants, and that number continues to climb. So it's fantastic to see interest and attention to what is clearly both politically relevant and salient and intriguing question that intersects with questions of demography and population change, of economic development and growth, of money, of politics, all of the good stuff. What better to talk about on a Thursday morning than pensions and the future here in Alberta? I'd like to begin with a very quick territorial acknowledgement. And before I do so, again, acknowledge that our panelists today are joining us from across the province. And so we acknowledge, of course, all of the treaty peoples here and the different treaties in play in the province of Alberta and across Western Canada. From the University of Lethbridge standpoint, I'd like to say oki to you and welcome to the University of Lethbridge. Our university's Blackfoot name is Iniskim, meaning Sacred Buffalo Stone. The University of Lethbridge acknowledges and deeply appreciates the Siksikaitapi people's connections to their traditional territory. We as people living and benefiting from Blackfoot Confederacy traditional territory honor the traditions of people who have cared for this land since time immemorial. We recognize the diverse population of Aboriginal peoples who attend the University of Lethbridge and the contributions that these Aboriginal peoples have made in shaping and strengthening the university and community in the past, present, and in the future. Next slide, please. Very quick response to the question regarding the chat. The Prentice Institute is a research institute housed at the University of Lethbridge, and our mandate is to investigate and disseminate knowledge regarding the big questions facing society today. Thank you for the question. I have three panelists with me today that I'm very pleased to welcome. In no particular order, then this is the way they got put into the PowerPoint. I'd like to welcome, first of all, Dr. Trevor Harrison, Professor Emeritus of Sociology here at the University of Lethbridge. Next slide, please. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Trevor Tombe, Professor of Economics and Research Fellow at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary and Co-Director of Finances of the Nation. Welcome, Trevor. And next slide, please. And of course, Dr. Jared Wesley, Professor of Political Science, Associate Dean of Graduate Studies, and member of the Black Faculty Collective at the University of Alberta. Next slide, please. I am, of course, the moderator with the gigantic head in the picture. I'm a professor of political science here at the University of Lethbridge, and as I mentioned before, director of the Institute. Thank you, Devin. We can take down the slides and we'll revert to our panel view. And so just a quick word of outline for today's structure. We have what might be considered a semi-structured format. We have a series of pre-considered questions to help guide our conversations, but no real instructions to the panelists as to anything regarding that they might or want to say, so they have free reign. We are, of course, as an institute here, a nonpartisan institute, and the faculty members who are joining us here today are, of course, welcome and free to articulate their positions, opinions, and interpretations regarding the issue at hand and the questions that I'm going to be presenting to them. We will have time at the end for questions from the audience. We have now 104 participants. That is managed through the chat, so you'll have to submit via the Q&A, and I'll then relay those. The panelists can see those questions in writing, but because it's a webinar, we have limitations on what the audience can do. You can't activate your microphone, for example. So again, welcome to our panelists who are joining me from their various offices around the province. And we're going to begin with a very generic question, starting with Dr. Tombe from the University of Calgary, then going to Dr. Wesley, and then to Dr. Harrison. That is just to give us a quick overview of your thoughts, perceptions, and receptions to the proposal that has, of course, been in the news a lot lately, both in terms of some of the panels and the engagement that's been done, as well as the original proposal itself. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Tombe.
Great. Thank you, Lars. And thank you to all of the participants today for taking the time. Hopefully it'll be and I think it will be an interesting conversation. So I guess my general thoughts and perceptions is very much, first, I think it's important to recognize that what we're seeing in September around an Alberta pension plan is just the latest manifestation of a very old idea. We had members of parliament speculating about the possibility of an Alberta pension plan as far back as the mid 1960s. Like at the very time that we were creating the Canada Pension Plan, they were musing about what it might mean for the CPP were Alberta to withdraw. And we did see interest in this plan really ramp up considerably in the late 1990s, around the time that the CPP reform occurred, because in some quarters it was unpopular when contributions needed to rise to secure the long-term future of the CPP, but no real action was taken by a government at any point in the past until former Premier Kenney started the Fair Deal panel that was to address a number of grievances as some saw them with respect to how the federation is structured. And one of the recommendations of that panel was to pursue a separate provincial plan. And that's precisely what the government has started doing today with a marketing campaign trying to promote the idea of an Alberta pension plan to Albertans. And that campaign is really centered on a single piece of analysis. This report from a firm called LifeWorks that's being referred to a lot by the government, by the engagement panel, by proponents of this policy. And this report does purport to establish that the Alberta pension plan would have considerable financial benefits for the province on the order of $5 billion per year, or a little over $2,800 split between employers and employees at the high end. And it's all really based on a presumption about how much assets Alberta would receive from the CPP upon withdrawal. And so I think I'll kind of focus more on that issue, plus one other frequently raised concern, and that is around whether Albertans over contribute to the CPP. That's another key plank in the marketing campaign that we're seeing right now. Many will point, and the engagement panel website itself points to $60 billion in contributions since the plan started, contributed by Alberta residents, in excess of what's received back as benefits by Alberta residents. So maybe I'll start with that point about whether Alberta does over-contribute and whether a separate Alberta plan would stop that, quote, subsidy that's referred to by some. So first, we don't have time to go into all the details, but pensions are fairly simple intuitively. Young people pay in, older individuals collect from them. And the CPP, your contributions are based on your earnings. And your benefits later on in life are also a function of most of your lifetime earnings. And that's pretty much it. There's no real redistribution across individuals, except to the extent that if you live a long time, you benefit more from the CPP than if you do not. So there's redistribution in that sense. But across provinces, individuals are treated identically, right? So there's no difference between what's paid in or what's received if you live in Alberta versus BC versus Ontario. So what we're seeing in the data, that gap between contributions and expenditures, which is real, it's in the data that's reported by StatCan every year. It's really just a function of our having more young people. And so in a snapshot in time, we have more contributions paid than received in benefits. But from the perspective of a person's lifetime, that's not the case. So me, for example, I have a 100% imbalance between CPP contributions and benefits. I get nothing back now, but over the course of my lifetime, I do. And so that payments in versus payments out is identical between similar individuals in Alberta and elsewhere. So a separate Alberta plan wouldn't really address that gap in any way. So then turning to the assets, the $330 billion that LifeWorks supposes we would get is based on a particular interpretation of the Canada Pension Plan Act. Maybe we can talk more about this as we go, but there's several potential interpretations. There's ambiguity inherent in the language of the Act. There is no single formula. So when we see political leaders or proponents saying that, oh, we're just applying the formula, That's false. There's words in the act, yes, but they can be read in several different ways. And the range of potential outcomes among a set of potential interpretations of the act is enormous. So my own analysis in a paper that Lars had up on the screen there does a quantitative analysis of the Alberta pension plan as well. And I apply what I think is a more reasonable interpretation based I think a more historically grounded interpretation of the words of the act. And that leads to less than half of what LifeWorks supposes, somewhere between 120 and 150 billion. So with a more reasonable share of assets provided to a separate Alberta plan, the benefits are far, far smaller than what is put forward by the government. Instead of a 4-point drop and $1,400 in savings for a worker, you'd have contribution rates maybe falling by a point, maybe at the higher end, 1.3 points or so. And so the benefits there would be something on the order of, for the median worker, about $300 per year rather than $1,400. So a big difference just from the asset split alone. And then, that's certainly a benefit. No denying that. Alberta is a younger population, so we do have an advantage in sustaining a pension plan, but we also would have risks in a separate plan, considerable risks. A single province on its own would be more exposed and more sensitive to standard risks, like what happens to fertility in the future and mortality, right? The CPP has risks too in that respect, but the effect of those future mortality changes or fertility changes on Alberta alone would be larger than in the CPP, which is a better, more diversified, both in terms of its investments, but also geographically, demographically more diversified than Alberta would be. And a separate plan in Alberta would feature additional risks in the form of uncertain future migration rates, right? Most of why we're young, and I'll conclude here, Lars, in just a sec. Most of why we're young is because of large inflows of individuals that may or may not continue into the future. So maybe I'll end it there by noting that currently the conversation is really grounded in an exaggerated claim around the benefits of the plan, although the benefits are non-zero. And we're ignoring in the public conversation, at least facilitated by the government, the risks involved, and the risks are considerable. And I think that's the right way we should be thinking about this: benefits versus costs and risks, and trading those off against each other. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And of course, who but an economist to mention cost and benefit in this conversation? Thank you for fulfilling all the stereotypes. Dr. Wesley, you're up next, please.
Yeah, and thanks for the invitation to join everybody. I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory up here at the University of Alberta. I'm going to take a slightly different tone, I suppose, than Trevor. Trevor uses the word exaggerated claims. I think as somebody who studies this kind of thing, what we're hearing from the government in particular borders on what most folks call disinformation. And I initially was very concerned about the level of disinformation being spread by proponents of an Alberta pension plan. But at the same time, I'm also encouraged by the public's apparent ability to see through it. And a lot of that has to do with motivated reasoning. And I'll come to that in just a moment. So, what I mean by disinformation is the deliberate spreading of falsehoods. And that is not an either or a black or white issue, but rather disinformation exists on a spectrum from spin, politics as usual, to half-truths, to lies by omission, to outright lies. The messaging from the government of Alberta, I think, tends too much to the latter part of the spectrum, which is part of my reason for concern. And we could talk about some of the dubious legal interpretations and economic analyses that Trevor highlighted. I'm neither a lawyer nor an economist, but I know few who actually side with the government on a lot of those issues. What I'd like to talk about here, though, is not unlike other elements of the fair deal that we'll talk about, like the equalization referendum. The government seems to be playing off of some pretty old tropes about Alberta's and Albertans' unfair treatment at the hands of the federal government. And it's the fact that in many people's views, it's not getting its fair share within Confederation. And on that point, public opinion is actually with the government. And survey after survey, our own Viewpoint Alberta analyses demonstrate that Albertans feel jilted, underappreciated when it comes to their role in the Federation. We ask a straight up question: do you think Alberta gets its fair share of federal transfers? 75% of Albertans consistently say we don't. And that cuts across the entire political spectrum. So unlike other issues that might be divided when it comes to rural and urban attitudes, or progressives and conservatives, it doesn't matter who you are in Alberta, you do feel jilted in that sense. But in this particular case, Albertans are clearly not buying the line that their pensions are part of that problem. And on this, I think they're right for the reasons that Trevor just mentioned. While a strained and provocative argument could be made that Albertans send billions of dollars more to Ottawa in the form of tax dollars than they get back in terms of federal programs and services, I would challenge that. Maybe we'll get into that in the Q&A. I think even that calculation is off. Albertans and anybody who's even remotely familiar with fiscal federalism will tell you that pensions are not part of a system of fiscal transfers. And the good news is Albertans know that. In fact, most surveys show that Albertans have few, if any, beefs with the CPP. Around 3 and 4 consistently over time oppose moving away from the Canada Pension Plan to an Alberta pension plan. And that, in my view, is the main buffer against disinformation in what could be, and I emphasize could be a referendum on an Alberta pension plan. In this case, confirmation bias works in favor of those folks who wish to protect federal institutions like the CPP, the social union, and national unity, in that Albertans want to believe, and they do believe in a Canada Pension Plan, and they do see it as being distinct from other beefs that they may have with the federal government. Thanks, Lars.
Thank you, Jared. Turning it over to Dr. Harrison, please.
Yeah, and I think my comments will follow nicely on what my colleagues on the panel have said. I think particularly as Jared has said, from polls that we've seen, Albertans so far, despite an overwhelming effort by the government, lots of money going out to try to convince Albertans of the wisdom of leaving the Canada Pension Plan, it doesn't seem to be working. But there's some other interesting aspects to kind of this opposition. There is, of course, the federal government, the Liberals, who have come out and said this is silly and will fight against it. That particular opposition is probably quite well liked by the UCP and Daniel Smith. Anytime the federal government, the Liberals in particular, and Justin Trudeau are against something, then that's viewed as a political plus. But there's a number of other things here as well, a number of other constituencies that are opposed to the measure, and some of them are a little bit surprising, perhaps. One of the most is Pierre Poilievre, the federal Conservative leader, who has suggested that he is not in favor of this and Albertans should not go along with it. The business community seems to be quite fairly unanimous in opposing it, and we could get in those reasons. But to give one example here, Deborah Yedlin, who's head of Calgary Development, business community, very well-known conservative commentator, has said she doesn't think it's a very good idea. And again, other premiers are opposed to it. And this actually, in terms of political strategy, is really a fairly damning thing. If Alberta wants to pursue in any number of ways a kind of independent way of, within Confederation, more provincial powers, you'd think you'd want to sidle up to other provincial premiers. But in this case, they've actually made some enemies among that. And finally, you actually have at least one UCP MLA who, from emails that were released a while back, Nathan Neudorf down here in Lethbridge, has also said he's pretty dubious about the idea of leaving. So the really interesting thing here is, with all this mounting opposition, some from people that we would normally think would be UCP supporters, why are they actually pursuing it? So what is because it defies the usual kind of political calculus. Well, what I would suggest, and we'll probably come back to some of these comments a bit later in answering some of the other questions, is that the reason lies in a whole series of things. One is the polarized nature of Alberta politics. And unfortunately, in Alberta, as elsewhere, it sometimes plays to the benefit of governing parties and even opposition parties to heighten the polarization around issues. It also speaks to a particular configuration of groups that are supportive of the UCP. And this is not a necessarily coherent group of people, but there's rural folk, whatever rural actually means nowadays. There's fairly traditional conservatives, old Tories, and there may be some within certainly the oil and gas industry who just simply oppose the federal government and views this as as kind of a way to smack the federal liberals, as UCP also views it. There's also Danielle Smith herself, who I think has her own ideological and personal biases against the notion of federal Canada. But the last thing I would say, and this goes back to something that Trevor Tombe mentioned earlier, is the whole idea of the Canada Pension Plan and the Alberta Pension Plan goes back some ways. There are historical roots to this particular issue. And it goes back decades to grievances, some real, some imagined, that were best articulated, I guess, in 1981 in what is known as the Firewall Letter, a letter that was signed by half a dozen individuals, including at that time Stephen Harper, which recommended to Premier Klein that in fact they pursue a number of initiatives. Among them was the idea of an Alberta pension plan. So as I said, I'll probably return to some of these kind of ideological, historical, and other explanations, and why also I think it is a profound and fairly dangerous policy to pursue based on those things alone. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Trevor. I'll just point out the Firewall Letter was 2001, not 1981.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Yes,
I know. I think about 81 too all the time. And in keeping with that, and I've certainly noticed in talking with my students, 1981 is a long time ago. 2001 is also a long time ago. How innovative, like when we look at this kind of proposal, when we look at the question of policy innovation and thinking about reform and stasis within the province of Alberta, how innovative are we really being? Is this politics and grandstanding? Is this a question of actual economic benefit coming back to the province? Or are there other historical and sociocultural factors at play? And we'll start with Dr. Wesley, please.
I think the answer is that they're all involved, and it's usually actually some competing players who are championing the political, the economic sides of the issue. And I can tell you right now, the folks that see this as a policy win for Alberta are not happy with the way the government's stick handling the issue. They think this might actually lead to a missed opportunity. I look at the Alberta pension plan as what I call a zombie issue. It's something that has been killed many, many times before, but yet keeps coming back to life occasionally when it's politically expedient. The most recent, as Trevor Harrison mentioned, the most recent iteration of this came in the Kenney's Fair Deal package. And a lot of Jason Kenney's Fair Deal package actually came from the Alberta Agenda, otherwise known as the Firewall Letter that was mentioned back in 2021. Now, the Fair Deal package that Kenney came up with was a direct response to the outcome of the 2019 federal election, which the federal Liberals had won, and in which again Albertans were largely shut out of the government side of the House. The Kenney government gave a mandate to a Fair Deal panel to explore 9 key areas. And when the report came back, interestingly enough, it contained recommendations related to 20 more areas, some of which also harken back to the Alberta Agenda Letter. Many of the ideas in Fair Deal, like the Alberta Pension Plan, they were recycled, resurrected, warmed over again, and in this case, put up with a slightly different political spin. The 2001 Alberta Agenda letter, as was mentioned, was an open letter to then Premier Ralph Klein from conservative thinkers and strategists, largely based out of the University of Calgary. It's interesting to know that the context was actually quite similar in 2001 to 2020. Albertans were consistently being shut out of the federal government, as I mentioned. Provincial coffers were relatively flush with cash, but memories of the most recent crash were still fresh in people's minds. Like Kenny, the premier at the time, Ralph Klein, was facing pressure from a right-wing faction from within his own party, and they were being very vocal in pushing him to seek more autonomy, if not separation from the rest of Canada. The firewall letter itself, though, it was a bit of a Frankenstein's monster of grievances. Pensions was only one of them. There were others in there, including a provincial police force, provincial tax agencies, Senate reform, and changes to the federal health funding formula. Of them, though, pensions I found in that letter to be the more cerebral of the bunch. A dollars and cents calculation of some of the benefits, if not the risks, was highlighted by many people that were talking around at the time. It was a policy wonks exercise. For a few at the time, but more now, it's about leverage, right? It's about gaining attention from the rest of Canada. In Jason Kenney's pronunciation, leverage, getting the rest of Canada to the table to talk about other issues that Albertans care about, in particular fiscal stabilization. Now, there still are some folks out there that believe that there's a policy case to be made, and Travis Tay's open letter or op-ed more recently, I think, tries to make that case that even without the outlandish calculation of what Alberta's share of the severance would be, it still makes financial sense. But even folks that were champions of it, including Jack Mintz in his most recent op-ed a few weeks ago, let us in on the little secret. At the end of that op-ed, he makes a point of saying, if we don't get a good severance deal, then we hope at least the rest of Canada will be paying attention and give us something else in return through other levers of fiscal federalism. In the end, Kent Klein, in response to that firewall letter, struck an MLA committee to tour the province, and the APP at that time was panned then, as it has been now in public opinion, and it was shelved. So in short, APP is a zombie issue. The question, I guess, is whether Albertans will put it back underground until another time, or whether this zombie continues to walk among us.
All right, my apologies. I'm just following up with one of the questions in the Q&A. We will have a space for Q&A. We've got some very engaged and quite lengthy questions covering quite a bit of ground, but again, we'll get to those at the end. So please do hang on to them, or feel free to submit them in the Q&A. Thank you, Jared. Moving on then to Trevor Harrison, please. Your thoughts.
Yeah, and again, thank you, Jared, for actually, again, putting some things in a kind of historical perspective here, as I will. And my earlier mistake was around the date of the firewall letter was simply because I was also thinking ahead to, or thinking backwards to some of the roots of what's going on here. And I would trace a lot of this actually back to that period of 80-81 around the National Energy Program. And what was for Alberta and a lot of Albertans a fairly traumatic event. And it, I think, has still continued to traumatize a number of people who are political people within Alberta. Notably, I would suggest Danielle Smith, who, if you look at it, she was born in 1971. I think so. She was roughly 10 when this was happening. Her family was in Calgary and facing, I think, the brunt, as many people did, of what happened with the oil prices. But it even goes back further than that in Alberta, this idea of Alberta needs more autonomy. And in a policy sense, what I want to then emphasize here is that the policy prescription of a separate pension plan actually goes against the developing history of policy in Canada since 1945. that in fact, coming out of the Depression and the Second World War, there was a general sense that in fact, Alberta was pretty balkanized, and it was at the time in a whole series of ways, communication-wise, transportation-wise, the economy, et cetera, et cetera. And we needed more integrative policies. What the proposal for an Alberta pension plan is, in some sense, is like throwing a grenade into Confederation, into what has gone on in an integrative policy sense since 1945. As Jared suggests, perhaps it's just a matter of getting people's attention, and certainly there's some people who have emphasized that that's really the secret agenda here. But in fact, again, back to what happened after 1945, is you have the development of a whole series of different integrative policies. Pensions was one of it. Many of these came about in the 1960s, but there was some developments before that time. There's also Medicare. And one of the things in the firewall letter was, in fact, a recommendation for basically butting out the federal government from healthcare in Alberta. And you can kind of see that also is a flavor that is enjoyed by some members of the UCP and by the government. And a whole series of other social and economic programs. But again, the general trajectory of policies has been to look for ways to integrate along economic and social lines the citizenry of Canada, so that people can move across the country and have access to more or less, the Constitution says something about this, more or less equal kinds of programs. If we move ahead to a couple of fairly recent things that have happened, not just for Alberta, but for Canada and the world in the last number of decades, the 2008 recession. Coming out of that, there was a general sense that, in fact, integration of markets had faced some real problems, but the solution was, in some sense, to re-emphasize programs and policies that would deal with the real pain of what was really decentralized economic policies under globalization, and more particularly now, the pandemic. One of the things that came out of how we dealt with the pandemic was the fact that there really was a need for a strong federal policy initiative. Think, for example, CERB. In some ways, this is actually not dissimilar to what happened during the Great Depression, when provinces were simply unable to deal with the cumulative problems of the Great Depression. And so we began to have more integrative programs. So just to conclude on this part of it, the proposal for an Alberta pension plan, which you can view as only one of several arrows in a quiver of greater autonomy for Alberta, actually goes against very likely what Canada, Canadians, and even Albertans need in terms of programs that function for everybody across borders. It's really a balkanization of social policy that, while it looks, as is pointed out here, temporarily favorable because of the age gradient of Albertans, in the long run doesn't serve Albertans very well as Canadians as a whole. So again, I'll leave it there.
And then moving on to Trevor Tombe, please.
Yeah, I think I'll have a very brief answer to this, really speaking to the policy innovation part of the question. What we're seeing now is somewhat distinct in terms of how it's being framed and communicated than previous efforts to put forward an Alberta pension plan, for two main reasons. That $60 billion that I mentioned, historical gap between contributions and benefits, being pointed to frequently by the government and the marketing campaign, is relatively new. 90% of it is after 2000. So right around where the firewall letter was written, for example, there just wasn't a large historical imbalance between contributions and benefits. So increased contribution rates around the reform combined with large inflows of young people into Alberta is really what is driving that imbalance. So it's a new talking point, if you will, on the issue. And then second is there wasn't historically a large CPP fund. That's really a consequence of the reform that started in 97, gradually ramped up. And we have, I forget the exact number, it was something on the order of $600 billion, give or take, in the CPP fund right now. And that itself is new. And so for the first time, you're seeing proponents really turn to that section of the act that would govern the asset split, and I think misuse it in this case to point to a potentially large asset haul that never existed in the past. So the policy conversation is distinct in those ways. And a lot of the focus now is on the asset split. That was never historically the case in these contributions. And that gap between contributions and benefits is also itself a new part of the conversation.
Great, thank you very much. In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of compress the last two questions so we have a bit of space for our participants. So starting with Trevor Harrison and then going on to Trevor number 2 and then ending with Jared. Let's think a little bit, we've alluded to components of this. What is this telling us about maybe sort of the state of mind or state of play in terms of political leadership within the province and some of the historical trajectories regarding leadership? And of course, where do we see this landing? How does this play out, both in the short term and potentially in the longer political landscape and economic and demographic landscape of the province? Trevor Harrison, we start with you, and I'll ask you to keep your comments brief if possible.
Sure. Well, as just a summary of how I actually view both leadership and or in particular around this policy, I think the UCP government is and its leadership is fairly narrowly parochial, dangerously partisan, and focused really again on the federal government and the federal Liberals who may or may not be even in office in a couple of years. And also potentially harmful, though, to Albertans in the long term. It is a kind of bunker mentality, but to go back to what I said before, I think one way of understanding it is a kind of trauma coming out of the National Energy Program, another policy or initiative, which, much like the firewall letter, a lot of people don't really understand and only understand it as kind of a term. But trauma is real, and the problem with trauma sometimes is if you look at the ages of, again, the people who are supportive within the government of this policy, trauma is also a trap. And I think much of the Alberta government is actually focused on the idea that there are enemies everywhere, sometimes enemies within the province itself. And so much of the policy is focused on that. And the way, again, to protect yourself against these enemies is to build up these firewalls. And so this is, again, one of them. Whether or not this is a shot across the bow or real policy is really, it doesn't almost matter because it's causing some real problems for Alberta, I think, in terms of potential for investment and building allies outside of the province. The other problem with this kind of mentality is that it's harming some of what Alberta needs to do in future. The world is changing, and to give just a few examples here, climate change. Okay, the idea that we're going to seek autonomy in a whole series of areas, and again, I think the CPP issue is just one of several that the government would like to pursue. Climate change, the necessary energy transition, immigration policy, the next ongoing pandemic. What do we do with that? Emerging social issues. The government's way of looking at the problems they face is really trapped in time and isn't preparing us for, I think, what Albertans need to do in future. In terms of just, again, condensing the two questions we had there, I think there's What we're also seeing, and it's not just in Alberta, unfortunately, is also, though, a lot of provincial leaders kind of pursuing these kinds of autonomous actions. You see it in our neighbor next door in Saskatchewan, not, the emphasis on not collecting the carbon tax. It's not going to fly legally, but it's kind of an idea. An emphasis, the growing use of notwithstanding clauses by provincial premiers over all kinds of issues. So what we're seeing generally is, unfortunately, in this province and otherwise, kind of a going back to the way Canada functioned some decades ago. And I think generally that's actually fairly dangerous for Alberta and for Canada as a whole. The final thing that I will say here is that this particular policy, no matter how it actually turns out, though, say the federal government does come back with a new estimate, and Trevor has said, somewhere in the range of maybe 20%. Some have actually said about 15% of the total of monies available. Whatever it is, it's certainly going to be much less than 53%. But this is also on some level kind of a win-win idea for the UCP, because if they were actually to get a really favorable deal and pursue it, that's a win. I don't think it's going to happen. But even should they, the response be that you're really only going to get 15, 16%, even let's say 20%, they will once again say, well, see, we're getting a raw deal from Confederation. This is what Canada, this is what the federal government is doing to us. In that sense, politically, it's kind of a win again to be able to say, we're hard done by the way Confederation is operating.
Okay. Dr. Tombe, you're next, please.
Well, this is, I guess, more of a political prediction question, so I won't have much insight here. I'll definitely turn to Trevor and Jared for insights on this. I guess I'll note that we are seeing polls from Abacus early on showing considerable opposition, from Leger just 2 weeks ago, I believe, also continuing to show considerable opposition. So I think part of what we might be seeing by the government through its large-scale marketing campaign is an effort to test how firm opposition is. The numbers they're putting out in terms of benefits, ignoring all of the costs and risks, is really giving the best conceivable possible pitch, if you will, for an Alberta pension plan, putting aside how unreasonable I view the actual numbers in that pitch. If these numbers, combined with millions of dollars in marketing, don't move the needle, then they'll be able to take one of the several off-ramps that they've built into this all along the way. The Dinning report may very well recommend not pursuing a referendum. The premier said that they won't go to a referendum unless there's full details around a pension plan. That's interesting, because we'll never, in the short term, have enough details. The chief actuary federally has been asked to compile what they think of as a reasonable estimate, but I'll note here, underline this several times, the ambiguities are not data. It's not about an actuarial calculation. There's fundamental ambiguities in the language of the act itself. If we really want that resolved, we either amend the act or we have a court ruling through the Supreme Court on interpreting what that statute actually means. So I don't see how we get to a referendum, given where we are, without a reference case to the Supreme Court, and they may very well decline to answer the question and say, "Oh, it's maybe not judiciable; it's a political issue." I don't know. So it's really hard to see where we go from here. Or at least it's hard for me. So I'll maybe end on that non-answer to your question.
Great segue over to Jared Wesley, who will then answer the question, of course.
No, of course I won't. I don't make predictions either. But in terms of probabilities, I think the chance of us having a referendum on pensions are much lower than they were when Kenney launched this gambit in 2020, and even lower since the Smith government launched the actual campaign to engage or educate the public about it. And there's three reasons why I think that is. First of all, Albertans are against it, but also that Albertans know that Albertans are against it. Some other issues like the just transition, for example. More Albertans are in favor of transitioning away from oil and gas economy, but they don't know that that is a mainstream position, and governments can exploit that false sense of social reality to their own benefit. They can't do that in the case of pensions. Albertans are against it and they know it. Secondly, Albertans don't associate CPP with the federal government. They see CPP as their own. And in that sense, the framing pensions in the narrative of we hate Ottawa and we want more power to Albertans just doesn't make sense to most Albertans, making it even more difficult for the government to build a case in favor of an Alberta pension plan. But third, the most popular politician in Alberta is against it. Pierre Poilievre's numbers are far higher than any other politician in this province, and he came out against it, which I think speaks to a broader problem that Trevor Harrison mentioned in the Conservative movement here in Alberta, or here in Canada more generally. The disconnect between the provincial and federal wings of the party have been laid bare through the pension issue. If they'd known that Poilievre was going to make that position, Poilievre had known that they were going to spring this referendum campaign on him, I think they would have strategized against it. And Preston Manning mentioned that in his not so secret email to all Conservative Party of Canada MPs that was leaked to the media by George Shahal, a Liberal who happened to be on that email list. I mean, there's obviously fractures within the Conservative movement that prevent a national Conservative Party from bringing national unity into discussion around the Alberta pension plan. Ultimately, I think all of this leads us to suspect that the UCP will probably rag the puck on this issue and not hold a referendum, at least until after the next federal election. If Poilievre wins, which polls suggest is the most likely outcome, they're likely to climb down and say that there's no need for an Alberta pension plan, that Poilievre will solve this through adjustments to other parts of fiscal federalism. If they don't stand down, Poilievre's in big trouble. I don't think any federal Conservative leader wants to start off their term with debates between one province against another. But if the Liberals do somehow pull it out in the next federal election, then I think the UCP then resurrects the issue again as the zombie is taken out of the grave once more, and we'll have probably a more political discussion around pensions. But that's my thoughts. Thanks, Lars.
Great, and thank you to my panelists for their succinct and very, very, of course, accurate and relevant comments. We're going to move now to some of the questions. We have received a few. The panelists have and should have been able to see them, but I'll read them to us. What I'm going to do, some of the questions were about the calculation component. We're going to leave those till last because I think that's whatever is after the rabbit hole or the wormhole around how the different scenarios that we could bring into this. And as was pointed out, the data questions and the actuarial questions, as opposed to the legislative questions, are in fact both related but different. So what I'm going to do, we're going to do this sort of more bear pit style. So I'll read out the questions and we'll see who wants to jump on what, if that's okay with the panelists. So the first question, noting that it's been made pretty clear that the fair deal rhetoric is often not applied to or internalized in terms of the CPP, but there is a question about, is there an accuracy or validity to the conceptions of the fair deal complaints or lack thereof? The second is, to what degree are minority constituents, such as Take Back Alberta, driving or maybe influencing this direction? Very interesting question. Next, a question on the APP engagement panels that have been taking place, the town halls, and the report, of course, and the possibility that perhaps this is in the question described as a pre-baked cake. And lastly, a very practical question, which is, if this were to become manifest, what would happen to those already on the CPP? Who wants to jump? Trevor, go ahead. Trevor Harrison, sorry, go ahead.
Lars, I'll take door number 3. The question about the engagement panels, I think this goes back to what Jared said in his initial comments here, that disinformation and manipulation, and to some extent, I think this is actually playing badly, though, for the government in its efforts. I mean, all governments attempt to manipulate or massage the messaging and to get the answers they want. But you always have to be careful that you're not making the people you're trying to manipulate, the mark can't know that they're being manipulated. And so some of the panels and the way they've been framed and the questions and the response actually from Jim Denning is heading them has actually, I think, harmed the government. So rather than having a fairly transparent, Q&A with people, it just looks like the government is throwing an awful lot of money at trying to manipulate people. And I think that's not to the government's benefit if they were really hoping that they would change people's minds on that. So I'll leave the other very good questions, though, to my fellow panelists.
Jared, the floor is yours.
I'll take door number one, Alex. Alex, but anyway, the question was around whether the argument that's made that Albertans pay more in than they get out of Confederation, and I know this firsthand because I worked in government for a number of years in intergovernmental relations. I was in charge of that particular briefing where we try to calculate that every now and again when new premier would come in. We've had many. They usually ask, how much are we getting out of Confederation? And I always said, well, we can calculate dollars and cents for you in terms of taxes that flow out from corporations and individuals, and programs and services come back the other way. But tell me this, how do you put a price on national security? How do you put a price on Canada's reputation in the world, both from an economic and social standpoint? How do you put a price on the ability to attract, the talent from other countries to come and work here? Those are the intangibles that Albertans get out. That's the cost. That's the benefit of being part of a federation like Canada. And to me, most of the conversations around, are we getting a fair shake? If you get right down to it, people are asking, is it worth staying part of the federation in general, right? And to me, we need to start talking about the benefits of the Canadian Federation more broadly. And I've suggested in some of my writing that this pension debate, we can get into dollars and cents, and I'm sure Trevor will in answer to the other questions. But fundamentally, at the heart of it, Albertans seem to feel like the pension plan is a national institution. It's theirs. They love it as much as they love the universal health care, right? It's just kind of a symbol of what it means to be Canadian. You can't put a price on that. And that's why dollars and cents calculations like this, I think, are a bit misleading. And with that, I'll turn it over to the economist.
Good
Yeah,
plan.
maybe I'll tackle the very last question around what would happen to those who are already collecting CPP. Because the shorter answer is we don't know, but probably nothing. And why do I say that? I mean, what'll happen with a withdrawal is that the Alberta pension plan will assume the liability of all obligations of anyone who has claims to pensionable or pensions due to earnings while in Alberta. So it doesn't matter where they're living throughout the country. If you ever worked in Alberta since 1966, you're caught up in that part of the calculation. And the Alberta pension plan, whether it would literally pay those individuals some amount and their CPP would fall, but combined it would equal the same thing, is unclear. What would probably happen is roughly what happens with the CPP and the QPP, where there's some arrangement between the two plans to account for the more mobility that occurs. And that, though, requires an agreement between the two plans. And that's something where it's not a foregone conclusion, but what that might look like, especially because the government here is putting forward as a benefit of the Alberta pension plan, not just lower contribution rates, but higher benefit amounts. And that becomes very difficult to harmonize the two plans if benefit amounts differ. So the CPP and the QPP can work well together. Like you could work your whole life in Quebec, retire in Kelowna, you'd collect CPP, right? You get wherever you apply. Or you work your whole life in Alberta and retire in Montreal, you'd get QPP. And the two plans then have a transfer arrangement between themselves. And it doesn't matter to you as a worker because the benefits are the same. But if they're not, that creates some really complex issues that might not be workable. And it might be such that the federal government deems an Alberta pension plan with higher benefits not comparable. And therefore, Alberta can't withdraw with any assets whatsoever in that case. So I'd say we don't know because of the way in which the government is proposing a separate Alberta plan would would feature higher benefits. But if everyone's an adult about it, if we actually go down that road and benefits are harmonized and these arrangements are worked out between the two plans, then probably nothing happens to those who currently have CPP benefits. But there's a real risk there and big uncertainty.
Right. And if I could just add just quickly to that, Lars.
Yeah, Gerald and then Trevor, other Trevor.
Yeah. So and these are important questions, and the overriding question is, at what point do Albertans get to vote on it? And by extension, at what point would other Canadians get to weigh in on this, because it has implications on their broader pension plan? So to me, talk about referendums has me thinking, is this going to be a 1980s style Quebec referendum where it's kind of like sovereignty association? Like, do you trust us to negotiate in good faith to get the best deal for Albertans, and they'll use that as the leverage to get a good deal? Or are we going to wait to the end, kind of like in an Irish peace deal thing, where we actually have a detailed plan? Albertans will have a chance to look at all the numbers of what the final plan is, and then vote as to whether we endorse the plan. Would the rest of Canada, aside from Quebec, have an opportunity to weigh in on that plan? These are still open questions when it comes to direct democracy.
Yeah, certainly there have been criticisms about the lack of detail and the lack of a proposal other than a withdrawal and look at all the money we'll have, right? Which is, most of us would like more money, but how you get and what you can do with it is always a concern. Trevor Harrison.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on something that Jared said earlier, and really as Confederation, being kind of a shared thing, it's hard to calculate who gets what out of things. And this follows on really the demographics that Trevor has also pointed out. So one of the pushing points here in Alberta is we have a young population. Lots of people are working, don't have as many retirees out as in Newfoundland or New Brunswick or something. The demographics in terms of the argument seems to work really well. But I'll point out here that in fact studies were done during the recent pandemic when CERB was going out, that Albertans were per capita the highest beneficiaries from CERB. And the reason was, again, demographics, because there was more people being laid off. So in some sense, when you talk about risks, the Confederation is kind of an insurance policy for people as they go through life or different changing circumstances, that it protects you. So the demographic argument in favor of CPP breaks down when you take in an example like CERB, the pandemic, or other catastrophes that could happen. For example, the price of oil, which is going up right now, what happens if it bottoms out as it did in 2014 and Albertans are being laid off again? So the demographics of this and how we see ourselves is very much situated around those things, and politicians make their arguments quite often around that as well.
Thank you, Trevor. I think some of us will remember the term jingle mail from a certain time, also closer to 1981 than more recent, but we know that boom and bust cycles here in Alberta definitely have an effect from economy onto our population. People come and people also leave. We've got 2 minutes left, and I don't see any more questions in the chat unless Trevor really wants to get into the weeds on.
Not the weeds, maybe a quick clarifying on an important question. So one here asked about forget the 334 billion. What about the 277 calculated to 2021? Are we saying the public data is misleading? So two quick answers to that. It's not that the public data is misleading, it's just not quite the right data because this bases CPP flows, contributions and benefits based on where you live, not based on where you made your earnings or where your past pensionable earnings were derived. So if you're an Albertan who retires in Kelowna, that counts as CPP flows to British Columbia or a British Columbian. If you're a Newfoundland and Labrador resident who works in the oil field, earning here, but living in Newfoundland, that counts as contributions from Newfoundland and Labrador when it's actually contributions from an employment relationship here. So there's a mismatch there. that's inherent in the public data. And then second is there's a difference between just an accounting exercise of what would Alberta look like were we to take its contributions and benefits, compounding over time, what number would you get there? That's a distinct issue from what does the Act, the Canada Pension Plan Act, say a province that withdraws would get from the fund? That's different. And so I'll stop there.
No, and I think that brings us full circle to where we started. So well done and thank you. I would like, first of all and foremost, to thank all of our panelists, the two Trevors and Jared, for contributing today and finding the time to engage with this panel. We had talked about this actually quite early on when the report was first released, but found time here. And I think it's been to our advantage having seen some of the action. Of course, every week is a different item in the news cycle. So there's lots of things going on, lots to talk about. I'd also like to thank the almost 130 participants who joined us today. It's very much appreciated. Thank you for taking time from your lunch to join us. And we see people from the university community, but also from well beyond. And my thanks to those of you who submitted questions in the Q&A. I think it's great to see people engaging in and looking for different perspectives on a lot of things that are in the public debate around this. And we encourage you to stay engaged and continue to pay attention to our government and the evolving debates around this. And I will wish everybody again, my sincerest thanks from the University of Lethbridge and the Prentice Institute, and my thanks to the panelists. And I wish everybody a happy Thursday afternoon, which is almost Friday, which is almost Saturday. Thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.